are not going to compromise with either crime, corruption, or communism inside of the American labor movement.
1945, the United States. America had just won the Second World War, and hundreds of thousands of GIs were coming home, seeking jobs to return to normal life. At the same time, unions collaborated with the government and big business to both protect them and give them power. All this led to the perfect conditions for unions to thrive and make a push in America. Around that time, around 40% of the American workforce was unionized. History, however, was not so kind to the American labor movement. If we look to the present, the U.S. labor movement is a mere shell of its past self. Why is it that now less than 20% of the American workforce is unionized? In the private sector, less than 10% are unionized. What caused such a decline in union influence and power?
Here we go.
In reality, the labor movement was already in danger. While New Deal politics enjoyed great popularity in the 30s, by the mid-1940s, political fatigue had taken its toll. With Roosevelt dead, a more moderate Truman came into power, who sought to equally appease the southern wing of the Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats, and the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party. While Truman voiced support for the labor movement, he did not do much to help expand it. Staunchly conservative Republicans began to push harder and harder legislation against labor unions as waves of strikes overtook America in 1945 and 1946. This political fatigue even began to affect the Democratic Party, which the labor movement was aligned with, and some major labor unions such as the United Auto Workers would have a full-fledged alliance with. In 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed with a considerable amount of support from the Democratic Party, in addition to the already Republican-controlled Congress.
The Taft-Hartley Act was written for only one purpose: to restore justice and equality in labor management relations.
Congress handed me the Taft Labor Act after 2 vetoes. They passed it over my veto. It was harsh, punishing law, and was that in the attempt to take all the rights away from labor that they'd been enjoying.
This remains to this day one of the biggest blows to organized labor in the United States. It greatly limited union power, and among other things, the Taft-Hartley Act made it so that any benefits the unions would want for their members would be given to all workers, even if they never went on strike. This removed incentive for workers to join unions and participate in strikes. Unions would picket, shaming employees who continued to work during strikes to combat this, but the Taft-Hartley Act also restricted this. It also banned agreements between unions and employers to only hire people who were in unions or who promised to join a union after being hired.
The Taft-Hartley Act will fail to achieve industrial stability because it is a negative approach to problems that require positive solution.
What the laws like Taft-Hartley did is it made it harder and harder to organize. And as it becomes harder to organize in the 40s and the 50s, that's why one of the reasons why that peak comes in the early 50s, because then gradually those restrictions narrow down the ability to organize workers.
Internal struggles, although not as drastically, contributed to the decline as well.
If there came a question of power as against money, certainly I would select power.
There was no stain on the image of the American labor movement, quite like organized crime. Historically, organized criminal groups such as La Cosa Nostra or the Mafia gained substantial corrupt influence and even control over labor unions by creating a climate of fear and intimidation among employers and union members by threats and acts of violence.
When I was writing that book on the United Automobile Workers, people would say to me, geez, isn't that dangerous? And I would think to myself, huh? I mean, back in the day, the UAW was one of the least corrupt institutions in the country. It had virtually no hint of corruption about it. But what people in their minds thought of was the Teamsters, that it was full of mobsters.
Through mandatory dues, strike funds, donations, and insurance benefits for union members, the organized labor movement in America raked in hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars annually. This was a major source of income that could easily be exploited, and exploited it was. Perhaps no other union was as well known for corruption as was the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. a trucking union and one of the largest and most powerful unions in the United States. Already in the mid-1950s, its leadership and dealings were under intense scrutiny. Officials like Jimmy Hoffa created puppet locals in cooperation with the mob in order to influence the union presidential elections. President of Teamsters Dave Beck avoided subpoenas by fleeing the U.S. for a month. Senate committees were formed not only to investigate Teamsters, but also other unions with connections to the mob or involved in racketeering. Widespread evidence of bribery, extortion, fraud, and collusion with the mob was found. Beck went on to admit taking large loans from the union and never repaying them, and was later also charged with tax fraud, painting Hoffa as a saint compared to him. And Hoffa went on to lead Teamsters either directly or indirectly all the way through prison after being charged with bribery, until his mysterious disappearance by the hands of organized crime. This widespread corruption not only in Teamsters but also in other unions led to intense scrutiny in dozens of court hearings, which were broadcast to millions of Americans, shifting the public opinion against unions.
That bit about corruption really stuck in people's minds.
Issues of race and gender also created internal conflict within unions. Women who had worked in places of men and African Americans coming home from the war felt that they were entitled to more. Having served their country, these people were tired of being treated as second-class citizens, and these unions could provide a tool for them to fight against racism and sexism.
And there was a lot of racism in the leadership of the labor movement and in the rank and file of the labor movement. White workers really clung often to the idea of kind of white privilege inside the union. On the other hand, kind of this is the flip side, the labor movement, and especially again, the kind of big progressive unions, became avenues for civil rights activism themselves.
The leading union for inclusion and diversity was the UAW, and through them the CIO, but UAW even well into the 1950s remained a pretty hostile place for African American workers.
There was a huge amount of gender discrimination in unions, and the unions, a lot of unions, helped to keep women workers out of the workplace. On the other hand, unions also became a major spot for women's activism.
The shift of the American labor force away from a male-centered thing, and the inclusion of increasingly women in a wide variety of occupations also hurt organized labor, because organized labor wasn't prepared for that shift.
By far the greatest threat to unions, however, was big business itself. In the booming post-war economy, demand for products like automobiles were greater than ever before. Businesses needed room to construct factories that could house the construction of automobiles and other products. The South provided open, flat land for industries to construct these factories on.
In order to make best use of the new automotive technologies after the war, they looked to build horizontal factories. Okay, so that they could lay out an assembly line that was just straight, and where the different parts, different elements, and different, the production parts, the drilling, molding, shaping, and so forth, were all lined up. Well, where do you get the land for horizontal plants? You find them on the edges of town, or you find them in cow pastures in the Midwest, or Arkansas, or Oklahoma, or Alabama, right?
The South had little to no union presence, and the generally conservative populace deterred union efforts. In 1946, an organized effort by the CIO launched a campaign called Operation Dixie in an attempt to unionize the Southern textile industry and later the South as a whole. This effort failed because unions attempted to integrate the black and conservative whites on the shop floor and created an attempt to have unity. This created a greater divide and spurred more resentment towards unions in the South.
It fails for a whole bunch of reasons. One of them was the explicit use of racism to divide workers, which of course has an enormous power and a terrible history in the South, as it does in the rest of the country. It was also the kind of height of that anti-communist fever, so it coincides right with the onset of the Cold War. So that certainly hurt. And then it kind of got tangled up in various kind of political pieces. But it's all, and those kind of combined together to bring Operation Dixie kind of crashing down.
At the same time, these blue-collar jobs that the unions were trying so hard to organize were also shrinking. The unionized private sector was shrinking greatly. New white-collar office jobs were being created where there wasn't as much of a need for workers to unionize. At the same time, unions failed to properly react to this change. This didn't mean that public sector jobs were completely safe either, however.
With public opinion increasingly against the air traffic controllers, combined with the Reagan administration's hard line,
convincing the flying public, many of whom have shied away from air travel during the strike, that the airways are indeed safe may be a major feat. But the airlines and the Norfolk Port Authority are vowing to do just that as they try to return to their normal schedules.
In 1981, 13,000 air traffic controllers went on strike, demanding better wages. They believed by having just as much responsibility and more work to do than pilots, they deserved wages similar to that of pilots. The Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO, then organized this strike in order to demand this. Ronald Reagan, however, had different plans.
But I must tell those who failed to report for duty this morning, they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
In the end, thousands of these air traffic controllers were fired and banned for life from serving as air traffic controllers. The blow was so heavy that PATCO actually had to shut down not much later. Throughout that year, there were no major strikes whatsoever, with the general public still wary of unions for reasons either unreasonable or reasonable, and the government still conservative, with even Bernie Sanders not even calling for a total repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act, and just a lift on some of the restrictions. The future of labor unions today are uncertain.